Look, you don't forget a moment like that. There I was standing in the center of that damn boardroom in DC, and my own father looks me dead in the eye and calls me uneducated and worthless in front of hundreds of shareholders. Can you believe that he disowned me right then and there? My half-brother Brandon had this smug smirk, and his mother looked at me like I was a mistake they should have erased. People started whispering, nodding along. I was a complete joke. But I didn't say a word. No crying, no fighting back. I just stood there cold as ice and said real calm, "You're about to hear my name where it actually matters." Nobody got it. Nobody cared. Before I continue, take 1 second to hit like and subscribe if you really want to see how this story ends. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. To understand why I didn't flinch in that boardroom, you've got to go back about 15 years. Picture a massive cold estate in Fairfax County where the air always felt a little too thin to breathe. That was home, or at least that's what the mail said. Back then I wasn't Major Cross. I was just Evelyn the disappointment. Everything in that house revolved around Brandon. God, even saying his name makes my jaw tight. He was the golden boy, the perfectly talented heir who could do no wrong. My father Harold treated Brandon like he was the second coming of some corporate messiah. When it came time for college, money was no object. Dad threw everything at Brandon Tudor's prep courses, and eventually a massive tuition check for an Ivy League slot that Brandon probably didn't even earn on his own. And me, I was told I wasn't Ivy material. Dad didn't even look up from his financial reports when he told me there was no wasteful fund for my education. He said I simply wasn't worth the investment. It's a hell of a thing to hear when you're 17, let me tell you. Then there was Diane, my stepmother. She was the architect of the Evelyn is slow narrative. She had this way of sighing whenever I walked into a room, like my presence was a personal tax on her patience. She'd lean over her tea, look me up and down, and remind me, usually in front of guests, that I just didn't have the head for the family business. "Don't worry, Evelyn." She'd purr her voice like broken glass wrapped in silk. "Not everyone is born with brains. You'll find something simple to do." So I went underground. If they thought I was brainless, fine. While Brandon was out partying on Dad's dime, I spent every night huddled over a secondhand laptop I'd scavenged. I taught myself Python, C++, and the architecture of neural networks. I dove headfirst into cybersecurity. I lived in Linux terminals and dark web forums, learning how systems breathed and where they bled. To my parents, I was just a girl staring at a screen, probably wasting time on social media. They thought it was meaningless. They had no clue I was learning how to dismantle worlds. The only person who didn't look at me like a glitch in the system was my grandfather. He was a retired intelligence officer, old school, tough as a coffin nail, and sharp enough to cut through my father's corporate BS. He'd sit in his study, smelling of old paper and tobacco, watching me work. He didn't care about Ivy League trophies. One night, he leaned over, pointed at the lines of code scrolling across my monitor, and said something I've carried into every mission since Evelyn: real power doesn't need to be seen to exist. The loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. Be the ghost in the machine. He was the only one who saw me. He was the only one who knew that while they were playing house, I was building an arsenal. But then, he passed away. And man, the silence that followed was deafening. The day after his funeral, it was like the last thread connecting me to the Cross name just snapped. Without Grandpa there to check Harold's ego, I was officially erased. No more seat at the dinner table, no more mention in the holiday cards. I was a ghost, all right, but not the kind they were afraid of yet. I was just someone they forgot to acknowledge. I remember packing a single duffel bag. I looked at the Ivy League brochures Brandon had left on the counter, and then at my own cracked laptop. I didn't need their money, and I sure as hell didn't need their permission. I had my grandfather's words and a set of skills they were too arrogant to even notice. I walked out of that house and headed straight for the recruitment office. If my family didn't think I had the brains for their boardroom, I figured I'd go somewhere where results mattered more than a last name. I was done trying to fit into their narrow little world. It was time to build my own. Before I headed off to basic training, I actually tried one last time. Call it a moment of weakness, or maybe just a desperate need for a father's approval, but I applied for an entry-level analyst position at Cross Defense. I had the certification self-taught, sure, but I could outcode anyone in their IT department. I walked into the HR office, and you know what? They didn't even give me an interview. They handed my resume back like it was a used napkin. The rejection letter said I was not qualified for the technical demands of the firm. Not qualified, I'd been mapping their server vulnerabilities for fun on my lunch breaks. But the real kicker came in the lobby. I was heading for the exit when the elevator dings and out walks Brandon with a group of senior developers. He sees me holding that rejection letter and starts laughing, not a quiet laugh either. He wanted everyone to hear. "Evelyn, honey," he said loud enough for the receptionists to stop typing. "You can't just walk in here because your last name is on the building. This is a high-level defense contractor, not a high school computer club. Maybe try a secretarial school. I hear they need people who can type fast." The staff chuckled. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I kept my face like stone. I looked past him and saw my father standing by the glass doors of the executive suite. He didn't come over. He didn't defend me. He just checked his watch and nodded to Brandon like he was proud of the kid's leadership. That same night, we had what was supposed to be a family dinner. It was anything but. Harold cleared his throat, took a sip of a wine that probably cost more than my car, and calmly announced that he was restructuring the family trust. Everything, the properties, the shares, the legacy was being transferred to Brandon. I was officially being bypassed. "It's about protecting the asset, Evelyn," my father said, not even looking at me. "Brandon is the future. Well, you're a liability we can't afford." I could have walked away then. I should have. But my eyes caught something on the tablet Brandon had left open on the sideboard. It was a live diagnostic feed from the company's main cloud server. My gut twisted. There were ghost pings, subtle rhythmic data packets leaving the network and heading to an unauthorized IP. It was a classic leak signature. A bad one. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, "your outbound traffic is spiked. Someone is tunneling through your secondary firewall. You've got a massive data leak happening right now." The room went dead silent. Then Diane let out this sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. "Oh, listen to her. The girl who couldn't get an entry-level job is suddenly a cyber expert. Harold, it's embarrassing." Brandon rolled his eyes, snatching the tablet away. "Stay in your lane, Evelyn. I personally oversaw the compliance patch last week. The system is airtight. Stop pretending you understand things way above your pay grade just to get attention. It's pathetic." I looked at my father. I was giving him a lifeline. I was telling him his life's work was being bled dry from the inside. He just sighed, a sound full of pure exhaustion, and said, "Evelyn, enough. Go upstairs and pack your things. If you can't be helpful, at least stop being a nuisance." That was it. That was the moment the last flickering light of family went out in my heart. I realized then that I could be standing there with the cure for cancer or the keys to the kingdom, and they would still choose to see me as nothing. They didn't just doubt my skills, they hated the idea that I might actually have some. I didn't argue, I didn't scream, I didn't even finish my dinner. I went upstairs, grabbed that single duffel bag I'd already packed, and walked down the back stairs. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I walked out into the cool Virginia night, the sound of their laughter still echoing from the dining room, and I drove away. They thought they were rid of a liability. They had no idea they had just lost the only person capable of saving them from what was coming. And as I looked at the rearview mirror watching that big dark house disappear, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt light. I felt free. And for the first time in my life, I felt dangerous. The morning I walked into the recruitment office, I didn't look like much. Just a girl with a duffel bag and a chip on her shoulder the size of a mountain. I signed the papers for Army Cyber Operations, and just like that, Evelyn Cross, the worthless daughter, ceased to exist. I became Private Cross, a serial number in a sea of green. Those first couple of years, man, they were brutal. It wasn't just the physical grind of basic training, though. Crawling through Georgia mud at 4 a.m. definitely resets your perspective. It was the isolation. In the cyber world, you're surrounded by brilliant minds, but I was coming from a place where I'd been told I was slow for 2 decades. I had to unlearn the sound of Diane's voice in my head every time I hit a wall with a complex script. The pressure was suffocating. I was working 16-hour shifts in windowless rooms at Fort Gordon, staring at lines of assembly code until my eyes bled. There were nights sitting on my narrow bunk in the barracks where I almost called it quits. I'd hold my phone staring at my father's contact info, wondering if I should just crawl back and apologize for being difficult. But then I'd remember Brandon's smirk in that lobby and I'd put the phone away. I'd rather fail here on my own terms than succeed as their punching bag. So I stayed. I pushed. I started outclassing the kids who had fancy degrees from MIT and Stanford. Why? Because I didn't just study the systems. I lived in them. I became a ghost. I learned how to track a packet across 3 continents without leaving a fingerprint. I learned how to find the zero-day vulnerabilities that kept generals awake at night. By the time I made captain, I wasn't just another analyst. I was a specialist. I was the one they called when a system was supposedly airtight, but was still leaking like a sieve. That's when I got tapped for a high-level joint task force investigating defense contractor leaks. This was the big leagues interagency stuff, high-stakes national security level. We were looking for a shadow pipe, a sophisticated backdoor used to siphon classified DoD tech specs to foreign buyers. My heart nearly stopped the day the first trace hit my monitor. I was tracing a series of encrypted pings coming out of a server farm in Northern Virginia. The digital signature was familiar, too familiar. It was a variation of the same ghost ping I'd tried to warn my father about years ago. I dug deeper, peeling back layers of shell companies and offshore VPNs, and there it was. The origin point wasn't just any contractor, it was cross-defense. The irony was like a physical blow. The family that called me a liability was actually the greatest security threat to the United States military. I didn't report it immediately. I knew how these guys worked. They had lawyers who could make a mountain of evidence disappear overnight. If I moved too fast, Brandon would just scrub the servers and claim technical glitch. I needed to be patient. I needed to be the ghost my grandfather told me to be. For the next 3 years, I lived a double life. By day, I was Major Evelyn Cross, a rising star in Army cyber leading briefings at the Pentagon. By night, I was a silent observer in my father's own network. I watched from the shadows as Brandon authorized maintenance windows that were actually data dumps. I saw the encrypted emails between my father and shady intermediaries. Every time they mocked me in their rare, condescending check-in emails asking if I was still playing soldier, I'd just save another bit of incriminating metadata to my secure drive. I was building a digital gallows, 1 line of code at a time. I had the server logs, the financial transfers, and the evidence of the compliance fraud Brandon had used to secure that massive $42 million contract. I wasn't just some disgruntled kid anymore. I was an officer of the United States Army with the receipts to burn their entire empire to the ground. They thought I was in the darkness because I was lost. They didn't realize I was in the darkness because that's where I hunt best. The trap was finally set. All I needed was the right stage to spring it. And that brings us right back to that cold glass-walled boardroom in Washington, D.C. The air was thick with the smell of expensive espresso and even more expensive lies. My father Harold stood at the mahogany lectern like he was the king of the world, his chest puffed out under a $3,000 suit. He was beaming, practically glowing, as he announced the crown jewel of his career, a $42 million contract with the Department of Defense. This contract, he declared, his voice booming through the speakers, is a testament to the integrity and technical superiority of cross-defense. It secures our legacy for the next decade. Then Brandon stepped up, looking every bit the Ivy League golden boy they'd paid for. He started clicking through a sleek slide deck showing off compliance reports and security audits that I knew were nothing more than digital fiction. He was smug, talking about how he'd personally overseen the encryption protocols that made their system impenetrable. Every word out of his mouth was a lie, a carefully crafted layer of a house of cards I'd been watching for years. I stood in the back of the room, my arms crossed, my expression unreadable. I didn't say a word. I just watched them bask in the applause of 100 shareholders who thought they were investing in the future of national security. They had no idea they were cheering for a sinking ship. Finally, my father noticed me. His face soured instantly, the triumph in his eyes replaced by a flicker of pure annoyance. He stopped mid-sentence and pointed a trembling finger right at me. "I thought I made myself clear, Evelyn," he snapped, his voice echoing. "You aren't a part of this family, and you sure as hell aren't a part of this company. You're uneducated, you're worthless, and you're trespassing." Security. Two burly guards in black suits started moving toward me. Brandon didn't even look away from his laptop. He just let out that same condescending chuckle I'd heard 15 years ago. Diane, sitting in the front row, leaned back and watched with a satisfied smirk, waiting for the disgrace to be escorted out like trash. But just as the guards reached for my arms, my father's assistant came scurrying into the room, white as a sheet. She didn't even knock. She ran straight to the lectern and whispered something in Harold's ear. My father froze. His hand, still pointing at me, began to shake. "Now," he stammered. "The Pentagon on a secure line." The assistant nodded frantically. "They say it's a mandatory briefing, sir. Immediate effect. They've opened a secure channel to the conference room screen. They're demanding a full audit review of the contract compliance starting right now." A murmur rippled through the shareholders. Brandon looked up, his smirk finally faltering. "A briefing now. We just finished the presentation." He didn't get it. None of them did. They thought this was just a high-level check-in, a chance for them to show off their fake data to the generals. My father straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. He looked at the guards and barked, "Get her out of here first. We have actual business to attend to." "Actually, Dad?" I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was low, but in that silent room it carried like a gunshot. "The Pentagon requested that everyone involved in the contract be present. And since you're so fond of saying I'm a liability, you might want to see what a real liability looks like." The guards hesitated. My father looked at me, then at the massive screen at the front of the room as it flickered to life with the Department of Defense seal. He thought he was stepping into his greatest victory. He had no idea he was walking right into the center of a kill zone I'd been calibrating for half a decade. If you've ever been in a room where people laughed at you like you were nothing, this story is for you. If this hits close to home, leave a comment and share your story. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because what happens next changes everything. The massive screen at the front of the boardroom, usually reserved for glossy growth charts and inflated profit projections, now flickered with the austere, authoritative seal of the Department of Defense. The hush that fell over the room was different this time. It wasn't respectful. It was terrified. My father stood by the lectern, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel anymore. Brandon was frantically tapping on his laptop, likely trying to check the integrity of his airtight systems one last time. The briefing didn't start with pleasantries. A grim-faced colonel appeared on screen, sitting in a secure facility, and his voice was like gravel. "We are initiating this mandatory briefing following the discovery of catastrophic security breaches within our supply chain. The integrity of several classified defense programs has been compromised." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Shareholders looked at each other, their faces draining of color. My father forced a laugh, a dry, rattling sound. "Well, Colonel, we certainly support your efforts. Security is paramount. But why call Cross Defense now? Perhaps we can assist." "Mr. Cross." The colonel interrupted, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "We don't need your assistance. We need your explanation." He nodded to someone off camera and the slide changed. The Cross Defense logo filled the screen, surrounded by glowing red warning icons. DoD Cyber Command has identified a sophisticated shadow pipe, a backdoor connection routing classified technical data directly from Cross Defense servers to an unauthorized foreign server farm. Another slide flashed up, showing a complex network map. Specifically, the data flow originated from servers that were manually whitelisted by your compliance team. Our forensic analysis shows that these weren't just security oversights. These were intentional configurations to mask data exfiltration. Brandon looked up from his laptop. His face flushed. That's impossible. Our protocols are... "We have the server logs, Mr. Cross," the colonel said coldly. "And we have the actual data packets. The ones you claimed in your certification paperwork were encrypted, but were actually transmitted in near plain text." He paused for emphasis. "The evidence suggests a massive, deliberate federal compliance fraud designed to secure this contract while concealing a lethal vulnerability." My father started to sway. He was a man who lived and breathed corporate control, and he was watching his entire empire dissolve into a pile of criminal charges. "There must be some mistake," he rasped, looking utterly defeated. Who did this investigation? This is preposterous." The colonel's expression didn't change. He looked directly into the camera past my father toward the back of the room. "The joint investigation was initiated and led by our leading threat analyst, Major Evelyn Cross of Army Cyber Operations." The silence that followed was absolute. For a second, no one moved. It was like someone had hit the pause button on reality. Slowly, every head in that room turned. Diane's jaw actually dropped. The shareholders stared confused. Brandon stared at me, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure hatred. And my father? He just stared at me like I was a stranger he'd never seen before yet, somehow the ghost of his past. I didn't smile. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just uncrossed my arms, straightened my jacket, and walked through the parting crowd toward the screen. I walked past the guards who had almost thrown me out, past Diane's frozen stare, past Brandon's pathetic, sputtering rage, and stood next to my father at the lectern. I didn't look at him. I looked at the image of the colonel on the screen. "Colonel," I said, my voice sounding incredibly loud in the small room. "Major Cross reporting. I am prepared to present the full evidentiary chain and begin the direct line of questioning." I turned slowly to face my father and Brandon. For the first time in 15 years, they weren't looking down at me. I was Major Evelyn Cross, the person holding their lives in my hand. They said I would never have the brains for their business. Well, I had enough brains to burn it down. The air in the boardroom had turned frigid. My father, Harold, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. As the shareholders began to scramble and the colonel waited on the screen, my father lunged forward. He didn't go for the microphone. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my blazer with a desperate, shaky grip. He tried to pull me toward the corner of the room, away from the cameras. "Evelyn, stop this madness right now," he hissed, his voice cracking. Whatever grudge you're holding, whatever game you're playing to get back at us for the inheritance, we can fix it. We're family, for God's sake. We'll rewrite the trust tonight. Just tell them there's been a technical misunderstanding. Tell them it was a simulation. I looked down at his hand on my sleeve, then back up at his panicked eyes. I didn't pull away. I just stood there as unmovable as a mountain. This isn't a dinner table argument, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through his desperation like a blade. And this isn't about your money. This is federal. You didn't just lie to me. You lied to the United States Army. You compromised national security to pad your bank account. There is no fixing this. Brandon slammed his laptop shut, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the marble floor. You're delusional, he shouted, his face turning a deep, ugly purple. I'll have you stripped of your rank for this. This is a conflict of interest, a personal vendetta. I'll sue you for everything you're worth, Evelyn. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a military prison for fabricating evidence against your own blood. I didn't blink. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a digital tablet, flicking it toward the main screen. A scanned document appeared, a formal Department of Justice authorization for a criminal investigation into cross-defense, signed and sealed. Sue away, Brandon, I said, my voice chillingly calm. But you'll be doing it from a cell. This isn't a vendetta. This is a multi-agency task force operation. Every keystroke you made, every ghost ping you ignored, and every bribe you authorized is logged on a secure DoD server that you don't have the clearance to even see. The room went dead silent. Diane, who had spent the last 2 decades looking at me like I was a stain on the carpet, suddenly stumbled forward. Her usual mask of icy perfection had shattered. She reached out a hand, her voice trembling. Evelyn, please. Think about what you're doing. This will destroy everything. Your father's reputation, our home, your brother's future. We're your family. You can't just erase us like this. I turned to her, and for the first time I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of finality. That's funny, Diane, I whispered. Because you erased me first. You erased me 15 years ago when you called me worthless. You erased me when you told me I had no brain. You erased me when you stood by and watched my father throw me out into the street with nothing but a duffel bag. I stepped back, breaking my father's grip. The power in the room had shifted so violently it felt like the floor had tilted. A few minutes ago, they were the titans of industry and I was the uneducated trespasser. Now I was the one with the uniform, the badge, and the evidence. I was the one who held the keys to their freedom, and I was turning the lock. I'm not erasing you, I said, looking at all 3 of them. I'm just documenting the consequences of your own choices. You wanted a ghost in the machine. Well, here I am. The colonel's voice boomed over the speakers again. Major Cross, are the subjects secured? Yes, sir, I replied, looking directly at my father. The subjects are identified. Proceed with the transition to federal custody. If this story makes you think about family boundaries, hit like. I really want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from family? Did it feel like freedom? Or loss? Let me know in the comments. The colonel's voice cut through the heavy silence like a serrated blade. Major Cross, bring up the internal audit logs, the hidden partition. I tapped my tablet and a new set of data flooded the boardroom screens. It wasn't the polished, colorful graphs Brandon had been presenting moments ago. These were raw, ugly lines of back-end code stripped of their vanity. A federal lead auditor appeared in a sub-window on the screen, his face as grim as a tombstone. What you're looking at, the auditor began, is a dual shell system. Brandon Cross didn't just miss a security leak. He built a mirror server, a Potemkin village of data. Whenever a government inspector logged in, they were redirected to a simulated environment where everything looked perfect. Meanwhile, the actual defense specs were being piped out through a second unmonitored gate. The shareholders gasped. Brandon's face went from purple to a ghostly, translucent white. He tried to speak, his mouth working like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. He looked at the screen, then at me, then at the exits. He was trapped, and he knew it. But that's not the worst of it, I said, my voice dropping an octave, turning the room even colder. I looked directly at my father. I spent months trying to find out how Brandon managed to pull this off without the CEO noticing. I kept looking for the moment Harold Cross was fooled by his brilliant son. I swiped the screen again. An encrypted email chain popped up. The sender, Harold Cross. The recipient, Brandon Cross. The subject line was chillingly simple: the path to $40 million. In those emails, my father hadn't just been neglectful. He had been the architect. He had explicitly instructed Brandon to bypass the expensive mandatory DoD security protocols to save $8 million in overhead costs, knowing full well it left a backdoor open for foreign intelligence. He didn't care about the risk to the country. He only cared about the profit margin that would cement his legacy. "This wasn't an accident, Dad." I said the words feeling like lead in my mouth. This wasn't a technical glitch or Brandon being overzealous. This was a conspiracy. You signed off on a federal crime because you thought you were too big to be caught. You thought the worthless daughter was the only threat to your name, while you were the one burning it to the ground. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The shareholders were paralyzed. My father's legs finally gave out, and he slumped into his leather executive chair looking small and defeated for the first time in his life. He didn't even try to deny it. The paper trail was absolute. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open with a bang. A team of FBI agents in dark windbreakers moved in with practiced lethal efficiency. The lead agent didn't look at the confused crowd. He walked straight to the front. "Brandon Cross, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal procurement fraud and violations of the Arms Export Control Act." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut on Brandon's wrists was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. He started to sob, a pathetic wheezing sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "It was Dad. He told me to do it. He said we needed the numbers." The agent ignored him and turned to my father. "Harold Cross, by order of the Department of Defense and the Securities and Exchange Commission, you are hereby stripped of all executive authority and barred from these premises pending further indictment. Your assets are frozen." I stood there, a major in the U.S. Army, watching the man who disowned me be stripped of the only thing he ever loved, his power. He looked at me one last time, not with anger, but with a terrifying, hollow realization. I wasn't just the ghost in his machine anymore. I was the person who had finally turned the lights on. The boardroom was clearing out as federal agents began boxing up hard drives and ledgers. The high-powered shareholders who had been cheering for my father minutes ago were now scurrying toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of Cross Defense. In the center of the chaos, Diane was unraveling. The woman who had spent 15 years perfecting a mask of cold, untouchable elegance was now a mess of smeared mascara and trembling hands. She stumbled toward me, reaching out as if she could grab hold of the Evelyn she used to bully. "Evelyn, honey, please." She sobbed, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean those things. You have to tell them. Tell them we're a family. Talk to the colonel. Tell them Brandon is just a boy. He didn't know what he was doing. I'm so sorry for everything, Evelyn. I'll make it up to you. We'll be a real family again. I promise." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel that familiar spark of anger or the urge to shrink away. I just felt nothing. Her apologies weren't for the years of psychological warfare she'd waged against me. They were for the loss of her penthouse and her social standing. "The time for being a real family ended when you threw my bags on the curb." "Diane," I said, my voice flat. "Save your breath for the lawyers. You're going to need it." I turned my gaze to my father. He hadn't moved from his executive chair. He looked smaller now, the tailored suit hanging off his frame like he'd shrunk 2 sizes in an hour. For the first time in my memory, the man who always had a booming lecture or a cutting insult ready was completely silent. He just stared at the empty mahogany table, his hands resting motionless on the surface. Finally, he looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot, searching mine for a flicker of the daughter he'd discarded. "Evelyn." He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know it had gone this far. I didn't know the risks were that high. I thought we were just cutting corners to stay competitive." It was the ultimate corporate lie. The "I didn't know" defense. "No, Dad," I replied, stepping closer so only he could hear me. "You didn't not know. You chose not to know. You looked at the warnings I gave you years ago and decided they weren't profitable enough to hear. You looked at Brandon's fraudulent reports and decided they looked better than the truth. You chose your ego over your country, and you chose Brandon over me because he told you exactly what you wanted to hear." He opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He went silent again, his head bowing. There was no more fight left in him. An FBI agent signaled that they were ready to escort the remaining executives out. I had enough evidence to push for maximum sentencing for both of them. I had the power to make sure Diane lost every cent and my father spent his final years in a concrete box. A part of the old Evelyn, the hurt, angry teenager, wanted that. But as I watched them broken and hollowed out, I realized I didn't need to do anything else. The system I had served with honor was doing the work for me. I didn't need to be the executioner. I just had to be the witness. "I'm done here," I said to the lead agent. I didn't look back as I walked toward the doors. Diane was still wailing in the background, and my father was being stood up by 2 agents. They were part of my past, a dark chapter that I had finally finished writing. I wasn't going back to that house in Fairfax. I wasn't going to check their emails or answer their collect calls from prison. I was choosing a boundary, a clean, hard line between the woman I had become and the ghosts who tried to break her. For the first time in 32 years, the cross name didn't belong to them. It belonged to the major walking out the door. It's been a few months since that day in the boardroom, and let me tell you, the air in Arlington feels a whole lot cleaner. I've settled into a quiet apartment with a view that doesn't include corporate logos or cold marble hallways. Most mornings, I sit on my balcony with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise over the Potomac, and for the first time in 32 years, my heart doesn't feel like a clenched fist. The news cycle has moved on, though the legal fallout for cross-defense is still grinding through the courts. Brandon's plea deal didn't go as well as he hoped, and my father is currently navigating the reality of a world where his name no longer opens doors, only prison gates. I don't check the updates anymore. I don't need to. Their story is over, and mine is finally beginning. I'm still at the Pentagon, still wearing the uniform of a U.S. Army major. The work is just as demanding, the stakes are just as high, but something fundamental has changed. I don't walk into briefings anymore trying to prove I belong. I don't look at my superiors or my peers wondering if they see the worthless girl my father described. I stopped looking for my reflection in other people's eyes. I've started the real work now, the healing. It's not as fast as a system reboot, and you can't just patch over 20 years of being told you're a failure. Some days Diane's voice still tries to whisper in the back of my head when I make a mistake. But now I have the tools to shut it down. I've realized that my value wasn't something they gave me, so it wasn't something they could ever truly take away. They were just too blinded by their own greed and arrogance to see what was right in front of them. I was talking to a young analyst the other day, a kid who reminded me a lot of my younger self, tucked away in a corner, working twice as hard just to be noticed. She asked me how I handled it all, how I stayed so steady when the people who were supposed to love me were the ones trying to break me. I just looked at her and smiled. I told her what I finally realized while standing in that boardroom watching my old life crumble. I told her, They called me worthless because they never had the clearance to see my worth. That's the truth of it. You can't expect people living in a basement to understand the view from the cockpit. I stopped waiting for their permission to be great, and that was the moment I actually became it. I'm not Evelyn Cross, the rejected daughter. I'm Major Cross, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you care about, take a moment today to reach out to them. And if you're the one being misunderstood, I want you to know you're not alone, and you are worth more than they ever made you feel. Make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and check the description for more stories like this. And don't be afraid to share this video. Until next time, take care of the people who truly matter. See you soon.